Okay, one last video. Let's make this thing quick. So, other major parts to the Iranian governmental system that you need to be aware of are it's the military. But it's not actually one military, it's several. So first of all, you have the regular military, your Army, your Navy, Air Force, all that jazz. And the standing army of Iran is huge. It's like 370,000 people, which is enormous. Like, look up the data on how many soldiers and active duty service people we have in the United States, and then compare it to Iran, and you will be surprised. Iran is massive in comparison to its population size. Now, according to its constitution, the military's job is to defend the borders. Like they do. That's kind of what militaries do. But the Revolutionary Guard is a separate thing. So the Revolutionary Guard was established after the Revolution of 1979 because the actual standing military of Iran in 1979 had been on the side of the Shah. And so they were in the process of dismantling it and trying to get rid of the loyalists who wanted the Shah back. And so the revolutionaries really felt like they couldn't trust the military because it wasn't full of their own people. So the Revolutionary Guards were created with the goal of protecting the Islamic Republic, which is a very different thing from just protecting Iran. The regular military's job is to protect the state, the actual physical entity of Iran. The Revolutionary Guard is to protect the regime, okay? Remember, state, very institutionalized regime, less so, government, least of all, okay? Remember our triangle of institutionalization there. Now, there's about 125,000 active duty members in the Revolutionary Guard. So we're looking total, if you combine the regular military with the Revolutionary Guards, you're looking at 500,000 people in their military, which is huge. Now, that does not include the Baji. The Baji is the excuse me, it's a paramilitary group that is trained through the Revolutionary Guard, but it's totally volunteer and it's civilians. And this Baji's resistance force is often found to operate outside of Iran where it's not supposed to do so. There have been some connections between it and Hezbollah and a couple of other organizations that are identified by most Western countries, including the United States, as terrorist organizations. So this is where you can get into state-sponsored terrorism, and we certainly do. Now, because part of the mandate of the Revolutionary Guard is to protect the Republic, that also means that the Revolutionary Guard is not just a military organization, it also has its hands in Iran's economic structure, which is super weird. But this is primarily because part of its job is to defend the revolution, and the revolution needs money in order to work. So that takes us to our next topic, which are the bunyads, which are super weird. And yeah, so the bunyads are actually something that existed prior to the revolution, and they are charitable foundations. Now, again, we are talking about a Muslim majority country. The notion that charity is like part and parcel of the way society works is not a strange idea because, again, remember that one of the 5 pillars of Islam is zakat, almsgiving. So, bunyads existed during the Shah, and they were these autonomous, tax-exempt charity organizations. Now, today, these bunyads are directed largely by Shiite clerics, which makes sense again, and these clerics, however, are appointed by the supreme leader. And these charities control a huge amount of money, much of which is siphoned off of Iran's oil industry. And they do things like provide something called the Foundation for the Oppressed and Disabled. That's primarily a poverty relief organization, focuses on healthcare, that sort of stuff, which sounds to the good. But you will notice, Foundation for the Oppressed and Disabled, they get to choose who's oppressed and disabled, and they can deny access, and that's something to consider. The next one down there, Martyrs Foundation. Very interesting. So a martyr is someone who has died in defense of the Islamic Republic. So we are looking at people who have served in, say, the military in one form or another, and who have died, and their families and children are looked after by the Martyrs Foundation. Now, this can and frequently does involve families of people who have been associated with state-sponsored terror outside of Iran. This is deeply controversial because government money is going to this organization, which then essentially benefits families whose loved one who's died has been perhaps involved in a terrorist attack, like perpetrating one. And that is something that a lot of the international community is very, very wary of. Now, the bunyads get their money that they can spend primarily through ownership of state property and state-owned businesses. And this can and does include some oil industry. After the revolution, these bunyads were nationalized, like so much of Iran's economic system, and their goal is to redistribute income to the poor and the families, at least theoretically. But that doesn't always happen. There are over 100 bunyads. They basically have their fingers on the pulse of some of the hottest sectors of Iran's, economic system, including the cement industry for construction, sugar, all of that sort of stuff. The profits go directly into their various bunyads. So that means that if you control a bunyad, it's really easy to funnel money wherever you want. So it is very, very easy for someone who controls a bunyad for the Martyrs Foundation to shove some money through a couple of LLCs or, some charitable organizations with a Swiss bank account number and eventually transmit money into the accounts of Hezbollah, which we do know happens. It's pretty clear that the Iranian government does, through bunyads, support some organizations that are identified by the United States and the UK and other groups as essentially being terrorist organizations. So that's always fun. Now, I want to end by talking really quickly about political parties and other linkage institutions. So I did mention this earlier, but political parties in Iran don't actually matter. Now, people in Iran have the legal freedom to organize themselves however they want. They have the right to organize and to assemble, but they didn't really put that into place in any great scale until 2009. The presidential election of 2009 was notoriously corrupt, and as a result, young people primarily organizing via social media outlets like Twitter took to the streets in these massive week-long demonstrations. The movement was called the Green Revolution. Unfortunately for the people protesting, they didn't actually achieve any of their goals, but what they did do was they made the government frightened of them. So we'll come back to what that winds up doing later on. The Constitution also does technically allow the formation of political parties, but there really aren't any political parties at all to speak of until 1997, after President Khatami is elected. And he is a pretty charismatic person, and with his election, a number of his colleagues are kind of swept into the deputy positions in the Majlis. But Khatami's political party was never particularly widespread. It is based around a cult of personality, really, rather than anything else. So these parties that do form, they tend to be kind of they're just flash in the pan parties. They're there around a candidate and then they disappear. So they change from election to election. However, there are two general coalitions of people within Iran. On the one side, you have people who are conservative, and on the other side, you have people who are reformist. They do exactly what they say on the tin. Conservatives want to keep things the way they are, broadly status quo. Reformist people are more like Hassan Rouhani might be considered a moderate reformist. He's much more engaged with the outside world than previous presidents have been, and much more moderate in his tone. Now, both of these groups, or any party that kind of wants to go against the creation of the Islamic State, Islamic Republic of Iran, my sincere apologies to that misspeaking. They primarily are organized outside of Iran. Iran is not a good place if you are a outspoken political dissident. It's a good way to get yourself arrested. So their leaders tend to be in exile. So people who are advocating for true democratic reforms, they don't live in Tehran. That's not where you are. Now, other major linkage institutions are interest groups. These are civil society organizations. Generally speaking, they're very weak. Again, people tend to be pretty cautious in the way that they express themselves publicly. There are a few major interest groups. One is called Workers' House. It is not a union, but it does advocate for union-like things. It primarily represents factory workers, and it's reform-minded in that it wants to see greater better pay for the work of laborers, better working conditions, safer conditions, but it is not a union. It doesn't have the rights of a union. It doesn't have the protections of a union. There are very few interest groups surrounding businesses, so there aren't a lot of civil society and professional organizations there, primarily because the Iranian government controls about 60 to 85% of the overall economic action in Iran on any given year. Which means that there's not a whole lot of private enterprise out there that can really compete with the nationalized industry that exists. So there's not really the space for an interest group that has those goals. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is mass media in Iran. So in Iran, speech against the government, period, the end, was a criminal offense starting in 1979. Now, they have loosened this slightly, largely due to international pressures, and some of those limitations have been lifted. So long as you don't blaspheme, that is, make a blasphemous statement, so long as you don't directly criticize the policies or right of the supreme leader to rule, and so long as you don't directly question the right of the Islamic Republic to exist, then you can say what you want. But those three things cover like 90% of what people want to protest about. Additionally, it's really hard for people who have alternate views about policy, even if they're relatively minor, to get those views shared on television and radio, because television and radio is broadly controlled through the state. It's controlled through the supreme leader, and as well as the bureaucracy. So it's hard to get dissenting opinions out there. Like I said, radio and television is run by the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting Company. There are some independent print media out there. However, it's worth noting that most of them, they can have their publication license at a whim. So you keep it really kind of dull in terms of what you publish. Things tend to be exceedingly academic in their publication. So maybe you don't directly criticize, well, you don't criticize the supreme leader at all, but you do instead do a deep analysis of, say, Sharia. It might be a pointed academic argument, but like you don't come out and directly speak truth to power in Iran, not unless you want to get yourself arrested. So, like I said, all publications have to have licenses directly from the government. They can be revoked at any time for any reason and without explanation. Every website in Iran has to be registered through the government, which means that if you are found to be publishing material on that website that the government doesn't like, they have the right to shut you down, and they frequently will. Now, since 2010, the government has largely been looking to try and pull Iran off of the World Wide Web, like essentially unplug it from the internet. Instead, they want to create something similar to kind of what North Korea does and what China kind of can do, which is to create an intranet, an internet that operates only within Iran. So computers and people can talk to each other within the state, but not outside of it. This was broadly sort of brought up in reaction to the Green Revolution of 2009, people using Twitter to organize. The Iranian government now blocks Twitter, so people who are Iranian and on Twitter have to be really smart about it. They have to use VPNs to kind of jump around the fence. So, there we go. That's Iran for you in terms of its political institutions. So do me a favor, guys. Study hard. Watch the study session that I put up there. It's not live, but it will take you through the study guide pretty well, I think. So good luck, and I will see you later. Bye.